how do you feel about the $20 billion that was spent on the electronic medical record and what needs to happen next?
Well, what we've been saying is medicine is a $2.5 trillion business without an accounting system. So when people ask me, what do I think about the billions they're spending now on this computerized stuff? Since we don't know what we're doing, we don't have a good accounting system, we're dumping more money in to a system. It's just apt to automate the chaos. You have to first straighten, before you automate anything, you better straighten it out. And we haven't done that. And what they said in this report, when I read, however, we believe that any attempt to create a national health IT ecosystem based on standardized record formats is doomed to failure, then I should have read further. First, there is too much diversity and incompatibility for any kind of a priori standard to emerge. With so many vested interests behind each historical system of recording health data, achieving a natural consolidation around one record format for any particular subset of data would be difficult, if not impossible. In other words, we'll spend the money, but we can't really change anything. Now, the other point we want to talk about, it may not make it any better. Like when they did the national highway system, they didn't get into that mess. They didn't have someone say, oh, we can't do it because this town doesn't want to pave the country roads. Well, we won't pave the country roads. We'll do it our way. And they could do that with a high system. But in the medical care system, they said we're going to put computers in office and let every diverse system do as they please. Well, not only doesn't that connect all the things into a single system, but it's depressed the people that they've given all the money to. You've given a computer to this person that was getting along. She knew her patients and she was making along, and the patients were happy and the community was happy. And now they don't know what's going on. They're depressed. And I know that for a fact. Not all of them, because I don't know all of them. But I know some wish they'd never seen the thing.
How would you explain to a patient today or someone on the street today what's wrong with the healthcare system today?
Well, I'd explain it as I did about the travel system. It should be like the travel system where you are in control of your own health and your own destiny, like you're in control of your own travel. Do you fly the plane? No. Do you build a bridge? No. But from childhood on, you knew the system and you knew how to use it. In medicine, you don't know the system. They don't have the equivalent of a map in the pocket of a car. The only system you know is I got chest pain, I ought to go to the doctor. You don't know whether anyone's checking on him, whether he's good or bad, or period. What we know is in science is the more variables you know about a situation, the better you understand it. And so you have to learn all those. And the patient, if they have a high blood sugar, they have diabetes, they know more variables that affect that blood sugar than anyone else. They don't understand some of the medical things about insulin and blood glucose and so forth. But they understand this got worse when they exercised or when they did this. Or they know all these things. They were emotionally upset. They're all interacting. It's a single organism. And that's one of the things we have to figure out by keeping good records and you understanding what we're trying to do. That's what that little flow sheet on the icebox door should be. Why did that blood pressure go up or down? You need to go to the doctor. You should sit there with the doctor and say, I got the data, and I think I know what happened at this step and this step. Let's figure out what we should do now. You should never sit across the desk from the patient and say, I think you should do such and such. It's what do we think? It's not what do we think. It's what do the data tell us. And I'm counting on you to keep the data. Don't come into my office without keeping good data.
Do you think patients want or can handle that type of responsibility?
If they can't, they got to be, well, to be told at age 30 that you shouldn't wet the bed because someone else was changing your diapers all this time, it is hard for you to change. I'll admit that. But we're all in this mess together. The doctors, they thought they were doing the right thing when they went to medical school. You thought you were doing the right thing when you trusted the doctor as some godlike creature. No one ever told you were in charge of all the variables. What does the public know about diagnostic error, and how extensive is it and how bad is it? Well, if you don't have an accounting system, we don't know. We found out we had an Enron problem in the business world because there was an accounting system and some of the accountants or people started to spill the beans. They had a system and it was being violated. In medicine, we really don't know. And you'd say, well, how could this go on so long and not just everybody be dead? Well, the human body is different than any other thing. It has its own healing mechanisms. It's correct. I've often said, the sickest kidney is brighter than the brightest intern. They're running all these fluids in IVs. The kidney will go down and sort it out. So you didn't need to put all that in. Sometimes the intern's stupidity will overdo it and they will get the lungs. I remember once we had a patient that was very, very interesting, but she died, and we were all running down to the autopsy to see what went wrong. She had this surgery, and the resident runs in, and he looks in, and at that time, the pathologist was just opening up the belly. And the surgery, this anastomosis, and this stomach surgery, he looks at, the anastomosis held. He was relieved. In other words, he did his part. I said, stand back. She's dead. Stand back. That's the disease of the specialist. And then I picked up the lungs. Well, your lungs should be airy and float. Drop a plop. They're full of water. Was that my responsibility? Well, she thinks you're not. She thinks you're her doctor. Well, maybe a resident or somebody else or an intern has started the fluids. But she's your patient and she's dead. And you have to work as a team, but it's not your fault because you don't have a system to work as a team.
Your Emory College address, the Grand Rounds speech, was really inspiring. And I wondered, could you talk a little bit about that? Did you feel that it was going to be a special moment? Did you feel that, did you feel that it was controversial? Just talk a little bit about that day.
Well, when Dr. Hurst asked me to come out and give those grand rounds, I knew if I just talked in general, as White says, we think in generalities, but we live in detail. I better get down to their details. So before I gave those grand rounds, I went up and got a record. I was talking from records. And I told him the system, well, how do I know? Well, I look at this record. And that's where I think it started off in that talk. I said, well, he's just a record doctor. Well, that's what medicine in this community is. That's how we measure it. That's what it is. I'm not interested in you. I'm interested in what happened to this patient. So I started to go through that record. And I found what I always found. Well, how do you pick a record when you go into an institution? You just say to some nurse up on the ward. This is what happened when I went and gave grand rounds once at, this is an interesting story. Two young guys that I had in basic science when I was doing research at Western Reserve got the internship at the Boston City Hospital on the Harbor Service. So they asked me, because they knew I'd been involved with all these things, and I said, look, let me tell you how to go, how to keep your records when you get there. But don't proselytize. Don't tell anybody. Just do it. And if they ask you about it, well, it's just logical to me. Have a problem with it. And they went there. Next thing you know, I get a call from Davidson, who was professor of medicine on the Harbor Service of Boston City. And he said, these two interns, they're two of the best. The residents want them on their ward. They're very organized. But you tell, we asked them they said, we're not supposed to talk about it. If you want to know, you have to call Dr. Weed. We just got here to get our work done. They did exactly what I asked them to do. So that led to Engelfinger, who was editor of the New England Journal. He heard about all this commotion going on over for a week on the professor's rounds at Ball City. So then he asked me to write an article. Now, we shouldn't take the time for this, but I have to tell you one story. On that rounds, I went in the night before. See, I picked a patient. The nurse helped me. I said to the nurse, I want a patient. Everything's going wrong. You'd hate to admit it, but you'd wish they'd either die or get sent home or something. Oh, you want to see Mrs. Jones? The nurses know right away which room to take you into. So I went in and took that record and said it. So I went through and I decided to problem orient the record. I went through and I read this, then I made that looks like right. And then I went through the Cardex and the order sheet and I said, what does this go with? And I found a bunch of stuff on the order sheet. I didn't know what problem went with it. I didn't know why they were giving all these fluids. So when they ordered me, I said, you don't need to present the patient on the rounds to me. I readily know about this patient, but I got a few questions for you. And I said, you're the resident charge? Why were you giving all this fluid? And finally he got frustrated. He said, well, it didn't hurt her any. I said, that reminds me of this young whippersnapper. He got his new little new Italian car, was whipping up into Maine on the weekend, goes around the corner fast, farmer across the road with a bunch of cows. He slams on the brakes, but not in time, and hits one of the cows. And it rolls over into the ditch. So he jumped out of his car, and as he jumped and walked, the cow gets up and starts to walk away, and the farmer's walking towards him. And the young whippersnapper said, well, I guess it didn't hurt her any. And I said to this resident, I said, you know what the farmer said to the kid? Well, if you think it did her any good, I'll be glad to pay you. And I said, if you think all this stuff did this patient any good, they'd be glad to pay the bill. But I think it might have done her harm. And you spend money every time you write an order. These are expensive things we do.
How did people respond to you in Emory after the talk at Emory or other talks? But in that audience, there was a lot of engagement. How did people respond? Like, what did people say?
Well, that's why Willis Hurst to me is such a great. It's too bad he just died. He was one of the leaders of American medicine. Not only a great cardiologist, but I think I remember correctly, and I don't know, but there was rustling in the audience when I was saying some of these things. And, there were professors sitting there and doctors, and, is this a terrorist attack or what? They didn't use that word at the time, but you could see. And Willis Hurst stood up and he said, let's listen. What he's saying is true. And we better do something about it. He showed an example of leadership that you rarely see anyplace, let alone in a medical school. And he got problem-oriented records going there. He had conferences there where he had people from 80% of the medical school sent representatives. We had a week session there where we went over the ideas with them. And the other person that is that class was his assistant at the time was Ken Walker. And Ken Walker deserves enormous credit because he and Willis Hurst showed leadership. They got something done. I can remember when I was 6 or 7 years old when my family lost everything and people were jumping out of the buildings in New York. They were committing suicide. And I was a little kid, but that affects you. Well, my mother didn't have enough money to get everything, and she'd have dessert, and she'd never serve. And one time, and to show you how bad it got, she'd serve, and she'd never serve herself. So I said, Mother, you should have some. I said, here, take Donald's, and I handed her my brother's. So I wasn't very magnanimous. But at any rate, I think that at those times, that's what Roosevelt did. He made us feel that somebody was trying. And I think, having seen the results of that, to me it's a miracle, noticing the mess we started with 4 years ago, that we're as well off as we are.